The date is February 8, 1968. A North Vietnamese Army battalion commander stands in the ruins of what was once the Hue City provincial headquarters in Hue City, Vietnam. His name does not appear in the American records, but his after-action report does. He has been fighting for 6 days. He commands approximately 400 men, dug into fortified positions throughout the southern district of the city. They hold every advantage. They know the terrain. They have prepared defensive positions for months. They have heavy weapons, rocket-propelled grenades, and interlocking fields of fire that turn every street into a kill zone. And they have denied the Americans the one thing the Americans always rely on: air support. Low cloud ceilings and constant rain have grounded American helicopters and close air support for a week. The weather is so bad that medevac helicopters cannot fly. The Marines have to carry their wounded through streets covered by North Vietnamese machine guns to reach aid stations. This is the scenario the NVA planned for. This is the fight they expected to win. The commander watches through a shattered window as a column of American Marines advances down the street. He gives the signal. His men open fire. B-40 rockets streak from upper-story windows. Machine guns rake the street. The Americans take casualties. They fall back. The NVA commander watches them retreat and allows himself to believe what Hanoi has been telling him for months. The Americans are helpless without their aircraft. The Americans cannot fight in cities. The Americans will break. Then something happens he does not expect. The Marines do not leave. They do not call for airstrikes that cannot come. They do not wait for the weather to clear. Instead, they move into the ground floor of a building at the end of the block. There is an explosion. Not incoming fire. Outgoing. The Marines have blown a hole in an interior wall. They disappear into the building. For the next 4 hours, the NVA commander does not see them. He hears them. Explosions moving through the block, room by room, building by building, coming closer. His men report Marines inside the structures, moving through the walls, throwing gas grenades, clearing rooms with a level of violence that makes the reports sound hysterical. When the Marines emerge, they are one building away from his command post. They have moved an entire city block without using the street. They have done this without air support, without artillery preparation, without any of the massive firepower the NVA doctrine assumed the Americans would demand before advancing. That night, the commander writes in his report a phrase that will appear in multiple North Vietnamese after-action assessments from Hue. The phrase translates approximately as follows: "The enemy is more dangerous than we calculated." This is not a story about a battle. It is a forensic examination of what happened when an army that expected the Americans to be helpless in urban combat discovered that the United States Marine Corps had done something the North Vietnamese High Command had not planned for. They had adapted, in real time, under fire, with weapons and tactics nobody had trained them to use. And the speed of that adaptation, the brutality of its execution, and the institutional flexibility that made it possible shocked the North Vietnamese commanders who watched it happen. Because what they were watching was not supposed to be possible for an army trained to fight in jungles. What they were watching was the American system learning faster than the Vietnamese system could respond. To understand what shocked them, you need to understand what they expected. And to understand what they expected, you need to go back to the plan, because the plan was perfect. And the plan assumed the Americans would do exactly what doctrine said they would do. Part 1. The trap that should have worked. Let's be precise about what the North Vietnamese Army planned for Hue City in January 1968. Because the plan was not improvised, it was methodical. It was based on intelligence that was, by American admission, the most accurate intelligence the NVA had compiled in the entire war. And it was designed to exploit what the NVA believed was a fundamental weakness in the American way of war. The weakness was this: American forces could not fight effectively in dense urban terrain without massive firepower support. Take away their helicopters, their close air support, their ability to call artillery on every enemy position, and the American infantrymen would be tactically paralyzed. This was not an unreasonable assumption. Since 1965, American operations in Vietnam had been characterized by one tactical signature above all others: overwhelming firepower. When American units made contact with the enemy, the standard response was to fix the enemy in place and destroy them with airstrikes and artillery. The infantry's job was to locate the enemy and mark targets for the aircraft. The NVA had studied this pattern for 3 years. They had watched American units withdraw from contact when air support was unavailable. They had seen American commanders refuse to advance without helicopter gunship coverage. They had read captured American training manuals that emphasized combined arms operations with air and artillery as the decisive arm, and they had concluded that if you put American forces into an environment where air support was impossible and artillery was restricted, the Americans would not know how to fight. Hue City in late January 1968 was designed to be that environment. The city sits on both sides of the Perfume River in central Vietnam. On the south bank, the new city. Modern buildings, wide streets, the kind of European-style architecture that French colonialism had left behind. On the north bank, the Citadel, an ancient fortress with walls 30 feet high and 90 feet thick, built in 1804, designed to withstand siege. The North Vietnamese infiltrated approximately 12,000 troops into and around Hue in the weeks before the Tet holiday. Think about that number, 12,000. That is 15 to 18 battalions. The entire operation was conducted under the cover of Tet celebrations when civilian movement was at its peak and American intelligence was at its worst. These were not guerrillas. These were regular North Vietnamese army soldiers, disciplined, well-equipped, armed with Soviet and Chinese weapons, AK-47 rifles, RPD machine guns, B-40 rocket-propelled grenade launchers, 122mm rockets. They moved into the city in small groups dressed as civilians. They cached weapons in safe houses. They identified 196 specific targets: government buildings, military compounds, communication hubs, police stations. American intelligence detected none of this. On January 30th, 1968, General William Westmoreland and the Military Assistance Command Vietnam were focused on Khe Sanh, a marine base near the Laotian border, under siege by two North Vietnamese divisions. Westmoreland believed Khe Sanh was the main effort. He believed the North Vietnamese were attempting to recreate Dien Bien Phu. Every intelligence asset, every planning cell, every senior commander's attention was fixed on Khe Sanh. At 3:40 a.m. on January 31st, the North Vietnamese attacked Hue. Within 4 hours, they controlled 90% of the city. The only Allied positions still holding were the Mac V compound south of the river and the 1st Arven Division headquarters in the northeast corner of the Citadel. Everything else was North Vietnamese. The shock to the American command was total. The shock to the civilian population was worse. The North Vietnamese had planned for a general uprising. They expected the people of Hue to join the revolution. What happened instead was a political purge. NVA cadres began systematically rounding up anyone identified as a government official, a teacher, a Catholic priest, a South Vietnamese military family member, anyone suspected of collaboration with the Americans or the Saigon government. What followed was one of the most systematic massacres of the war. The victims were tied with wire. Many were tortured. Many were buried alive. The NVA executed between 2,800 and 6,000 civilians in the first week of the occupation. Mass graves would be discovered for months after the battle ended. Some victims had been clubbed to death to save ammunition, but the North Vietnamese leadership did not know this plan was failing yet. On February 1st, they controlled Hue. They had fortified every building. They had pre-sighted every street for machine gun and RPG fire, and the weather had turned. Low clouds, heavy rain, American helicopters grounded, close air support impossible. The trap was set. The Americans would have to retake Hue the hard way, street by street, building by building, without the firepower they depended on. The NVA commanders prepared to watch the Americans fail. Part 2. The enemy they did not expect. The 1st Marine units ordered into Hue were companies from 1st Battalion 1st Marines and 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. They had been conducting operations in the countryside. They were equipped for jungle warfare. Flak jackets, M16 rifles, M79 grenade launchers. They had received approximately 1 hour of training in urban combat during their entire pre-deployment workup. 1 hour. The Marine Corps in 1968 had effectively deleted urban warfare from its training curriculum. The focus was jungle operations, small unit patrols, ambushes, search and destroy missions in rural areas. The last time the Marine Corps had fought a major urban battle was Seoul in 1950, 18 years earlier. The institutional knowledge had been lost. When the Marines entered Hue on January 31st and February 1st, they were walking into a type of combat they had never trained for. The initial attempts to clear the city followed standard doctrine: advance down the streets in column, use the tanks for fire support, locate the enemy and destroy them. It was a disaster. The North Vietnamese had converted every building into a fortress. Every street corner was a pre-registered kill zone. Marines advancing in the open were hit by B-40 rockets from upper-story windows. Snipers fired from rooftops. Machine gun teams had interlocking fields of fire that turned intersections into death traps. Alpha Company 1st Battalion 1st Marines took 50% casualties in the first 48 hours. The company commander was wounded, the executive officer was wounded. Platoon commanders were being killed or wounded faster than they could be replaced. The NVA commanders watching this initial fighting saw exactly what they expected to see. American forces taking heavy casualties, American units pinned down, American commanders calling for air support that could not come because of the weather. The Americans were helpless, just as Hanoi had predicted, and then the Americans changed the way they fought. This is the part the North Vietnamese did not expect. This is the adaptation that shocked them, because what happened next was not the result of orders from division headquarters. It was not a new tactical manual distributed from above. It was small unit leaders at the company and platoon level looking at a problem, recognizing that standard tactics were getting their men killed, and improvising solutions on the spot. Lieutenant Colonel Ernie Cheatham commanded 2nd Battalion 5th Marines. He watched his companies take casualties trying to advance down streets. He recognized the problem immediately. The streets were killing zones. The Marines needed to stay off the streets. Cheatham went looking for references. At the 5th Marine Regiment headquarters, he found old field manuals from World War II and Korea. Combat in built-up areas, attack on fortified positions, manuals that had been written for fighting in European cities and had been collecting dust for 15 years. He read them. He extracted the key lesson. Stay off the streets, move through the buildings. The technique is called mouse holing. You blow a hole in the interior wall between two buildings. You move through the hole into the next building. You clear that building room by room. Then you blow another hole into the next building. You move through entire city blocks without ever exposing yourself to the street. Cheatham issued the order to his company commanders: stop using the streets, start using the buildings. The Marines adapted immediately. But here is the thing the NVA did not account for. The Americans did not just adopt a new tactic. They improvised the tools to make it work. Because the Marine Corps had not equipped its infantry for urban warfare. There were no breaching charges in the supply system. No specialized demolitions for blowing through concrete walls, no doctrine for what weapons to use at what range in room clearing. So the Marines used what they had, and they used it in ways nobody had trained them to use. The M20 bazooka, a weapon designed to destroy bunkers, became a wall breaching tool. Marines would fire it point blank into an interior wall to create an entry point. C4 plastic explosive, normally used for demolitions, was shaped into charges and used to blast through masonry. The M79 grenade launcher, designed for indirect fire, became a precision weapon for shooting grenades through windows from across the street. The M50 Ontos was an anti-tank vehicle. It carried 6 106mm recoilless rifles. It was designed to fight Soviet armor in Europe. In Hue, the Marines used it as a building demolition platform. 6 recoilless rifles firing simultaneously could collapse an entire structure. The Ontos crews began using it as a sniper weapon. They would identify an NVA strongpoint, move the Ontos into position and fire a single rifle to punch a hole through the wall and kill everyone inside. The M42 Duster was an anti-aircraft vehicle. Twin 40mm cannons designed to shoot down aircraft. In Hue, the Marines used it for direct fire against upper-story windows where NVA snipers were positioned. The 40mm rounds would shred the building facade and suppress the snipers long enough for infantry to advance. The North Vietnamese had prepared for an enemy that would fight according to doctrine. They got an enemy that rewrote the doctrine in real time based on what worked. And the most shocking adaptation, the one that appears repeatedly in North Vietnamese after-action reports, was the use of CS gas. CS gas is tear gas, riot control agent. Not lethal but intensely irritating. It causes tears, coughing, skin irritation, temporary blindness. In the United States, it was used by police to control crowds. In Vietnam, it was used by the Marines to flush the North Vietnamese out of fortified buildings. The standard American tactic when faced with a fortified enemy position was to call in an airstrike or artillery, destroy the building and everyone in it. In Hue, the weather had eliminated air support, and there were restrictions on artillery use because the city was considered a historic site and because civilians were still present. The Marines needed a way to force the NVA out of their positions without leveling the entire city. The solution was gas. Marine units began using E-8 gas launchers to saturate NVA-held buildings with CS. The gas filled the rooms, it seeped into basements, it made breathing impossible. The NVA defenders had to choose, stay in the building and suffocate, or come out into the street where Marine machine guns were waiting. The North Vietnamese had not prepared for chemical warfare in urban combat. Most NVA soldiers did not have gas masks. Those who did found that the masks were inadequate against sustained exposure. NVA units reported that entire squads were incapacitated by the gas. Men were stumbling into the streets, unable to see or breathe. Marines were shooting them as they emerged. The NVA commanders had expected the Americans to withdraw when they could not use air power. Instead, the Americans had developed a ground-level suppression system that was in some ways more effective than airstrikes because it forced the defenders to abandon prepared positions. This is what shocked the North Vietnamese High Command. Not that the Americans were brave, the NVA had always acknowledged that American soldiers could be brave. What shocked them was that the Americans adapted faster than the NVA tactical planning could respond, using weapons in ways that violated every assumption the NVA had made about American doctrine. Part 3. The forensic breakdown of the adaptation. Let's be absolutely precise about what the Marines did in Hue and why it worked. Because the adaptation was not random. It was the product of a specific kind of organizational culture that the North Vietnamese army did not have an equivalent for. The NVA operated under a centralized command system. Plans were made at division or corps level. Company and battalion commanders executed those plans. Initiative at the small unit level was discouraged. The system worked when the plan was good and the enemy behaved as expected. The American system, particularly in the Marine Corps, operated differently. Company and platoon commanders were expected to make decisions. Non-commissioned officers were expected to improvise. The institutional assumption was that the men closest to the problem were best positioned to solve it. In Hue, this cultural difference became a material fact of combat. The mouse-holing technique required Marines to make decisions room by room about where to blow the next hole, how much explosive to use, whether to throw grenades or gas before entering. No central headquarters could micromanage those decisions. The lance corporals and sergeants making them had to judge the situation based on what they saw in front of them. The use of the ontos as a precision demolition weapon required the vehicle commander to make targeting decisions without reference to higher command. Which building to hit, which wall to breach, whether to use one rifle or all 6. Those decisions were being made by corporals and sergeants. The integration of CS gas into the attack required squad leaders to coordinate with the gas launcher teams, identify which buildings to saturate, and position their machine guns to cover the exits. This was happening at the squad level. The North Vietnamese command system did not prepare its junior leaders to operate this way. NVA company commanders were executing the defensive plan that had been written before the battle started. When the Americans changed their tactics, the NVA commanders at the battalion and company level did not have the authority or the training to change the defense in response. Here is a specific example that illustrates the difference. On February 9th, Hotel Company 2nd Battalion 5th Marines was tasked with clearing the Hue City provincial headquarters. This was a large government building in the southern part of the city. The North Vietnamese had fortified it with machine gun nests on every floor. They had pre-positioned ammunition and supplies. They had built firing positions that covered all the approaches. The Marine Company commander, Captain George Christmas, looked at the building and recognized that a frontal assault would result in unacceptable casualties. He decided to use the buildings on either side as cover. His Marines would mouse-hole through the adjacent structures, bypass the main entrance, and attack the building from an unexpected angle. Christmas did not ask permission from battalion. He did not wait for approval from regiment. He made the decision at the company level and executed it. His Marines blew through the walls of the neighboring buildings. They used CS gas to flush NVA defenders from the rooms. They fought floor by floor for 5 hours. When they reached the roof, they raised the American flag. The building was taken. Total Marine casualties for that action were significantly lower than they would have been with a frontal assault. The North Vietnamese company commander defending that building had prepared for an attack from the front. He had positioned his heavy weapons to cover the main entrance. He had prepared fallback positions inside the building. When the Marines attacked from the side through the walls, his defensive plan collapsed. He did not have the authority to reposition his forces or change the defense without orders from higher command. By the time those orders could be requested and received, the Marines were inside the building. This happened repeatedly throughout the battle. Marines adapting at the squad and platoon level faster than the NVA company and battalion commanders could respond. The North Vietnamese had prepared for a fight against an enemy that would advance predictably, call for air support when pinned down, and withdraw if the casualties became too high. They got an enemy that moved through walls, used tear gas as a weapon, and kept advancing regardless of casualties. Here is the tactical result of that adaptation measured in the only metric that matters in combat: ground taken per day. In the first 3 days of the battle, before the Marines adapted their tactics, the advance in the southern city was measured in yards, individual buildings, street corners, increments so small that the daily situation reports described progress as negligible. After February 6th, when the mouse-holing and CS gas tactics became standard procedure, the rate of advance increased dramatically. Entire city blocks were cleared in a single day. The provincial headquarters fell, the treasury building fell, the prison fell. By February 10th, the entire southern city was back under Allied control. The North Vietnamese had held 90% of Hue for 10 days. They lost the southern half of the city in 4 days once the Marines changed how they fought. The NVA reports from this period describe the American advance as relentless. One report uses the phrase absolutely brutal to describe the room-clearing tactics. Another describes the Marines as showing no regard for their own casualties, which was not accurate but reveals what the NVA defenders were experiencing. The Marines were not ignoring casualties. They were accepting casualties as the cost of continuing the advance. This is a critical distinction. The NVA plan had assumed that high casualties would cause the Americans to stop, to withdraw, to wait for air support. The Americans did not stop. They adapted their tactics to reduce casualties where possible, but they did not stop advancing. Part 4. The system behind the adaptation. There is a question that needs to be asked here. Why were the Marines able to adapt, and the North Vietnamese were not? The answer is not individual courage or individual competence. Both sides had brave soldiers. Both sides had competent officers. The answer is systemic. It is about how the two organizations prepared for war and how they responded when the war did not match the preparation. The United States Marine Corps in 1968 had eliminated urban warfare from its training. This was an institutional failure. The Marines arriving in Hue had not been trained for city fighting, but the institution had given them something else. It had trained them to solve problems. Marine non-commissioned officer training emphasized initiative. Squad leaders were taught to assess situations and make decisions without waiting for orders. Fire team leaders were taught to improvise. The institutional culture rewarded aggression and punished passivity. When the Marines in Hue encountered a tactical problem, the streets are killing zones, the institutional reflex was not to wait for orders from above. It was to solve the problem with the resources available. The North Vietnamese army had a different institutional culture. It was built on a model of centralized planning and disciplined execution. Junior officers were trained to carry out orders, not to improvise. The system worked when the plan was good. The plan for Hue was good. The infiltration was successful. The occupation was successful. The fortification of the city was successful. But the plan had not accounted for an enemy that would change tactics in the middle of the battle. When the Marines stopped using the streets and started using the buildings, the NVA defensive plan became less effective. The NVA battalion and company commanders recognized this. But changing the defense required approval from higher command. Requesting that approval took time. Time the Marines did not give them. There is a document that illustrates this difference perfectly. It is a captured North Vietnamese after-action report from the Hue battle. The report describes the American tactics. It describes the use of CS gas. It describes the mouse holing. It describes the ontos being used as a building demolition weapon. And it concludes with a recommendation that NVA units prepare countermeasures for these tactics in future urban battles. The report was written after the battle was over. The lessons were identified after the Americans had already won. The Marines were learning during the battle, trying a tactic, seeing if it worked. If it worked, spreading it to other units immediately. If it did not work, trying something else. The timeline for this learning cycle was hours or days. The North Vietnamese learning cycle was weeks or months. Observe the enemy tactic, write a report, send the report to higher command, have higher command analyze the report, issue new guidance to field units. By the time that cycle completed, the battle was over. This is what systems look like when they collide at different speeds. One system learning in real time under fire, the other system learning after the fact from written reports. The Marines had another advantage that does not appear in most histories of Hue but was critically important. Popular culture. Many of the junior Marines and NCOs fighting in Hue had grown up watching a television show called Combat. It was a World War II drama that aired from 1962 to 1967. The show was noted for its realism. It had been produced with input from actual World War II veterans. It depicted small unit infantry tactics, house clearing, street fighting, urban combat. The Marines who watched that show as teenagers absorbed lessons about how to fight in cities. Those lessons were not formal training, they were not doctrine. But when the Marines in Hue found themselves fighting room to room, some of them later reported that they were drawing on tactics they had seen on television. This sounds absurd until you recognize what it represents. The American cultural saturation with military content, even fictional military content, created a baseline familiarity with combat concepts that did not exist in North Vietnamese culture. A 20-year-old Marine from California might have watched hundreds of hours of war movies and television shows before he ever picked up a rifle. That exposure created a mental library of tactical concepts that could be drawn on when formal training was insufficient. The North Vietnamese soldiers had no equivalent. Their cultural references for urban combat were limited to their own training and the experiences of the French colonial war. They had not been exposed to the kind of media saturation that characterized American culture in the 1960s. This is not the primary reason the Marines won Hue, but it is part of the explanation for why the Marines were able to improvise tactics that the North Vietnamese did not expect. Part 5. The Citadel and the Breaking Point. The southern city was cleared by February 10th. The Citadel remained. And the Citadel was a different kind of nightmare. The Citadel was built in 1804 as a fortress. The outer walls were 30 feet high and 90 feet thick at the base. The design was based on French military engineering from the Napoleonic era. The walls were stone and masonry constructed to withstand cannon fire. Inside the Citadel, the North Vietnamese had positioned approximately 4 battalions, 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers. They had prepared defensive positions in the palace buildings. They had dug fighting holes in the courtyards. They had positioned machine guns on the walls to fire down on anyone approaching. The Marines tasked with clearing the Citadel were from 1st Battalion 5th Marines. They entered the Citadel on February 13. The fighting was even more intense than the southern city. The thick walls of the Citadel absorbed damage that would have collapsed modern buildings. Marines firing 90mm tank rounds at close range into the walls found that it took multiple hits to breach a single section. The heat rounds, designed to penetrate tank armor, were marginally effective against 30-foot thick stone walls. The mouse-holing technique that had worked in the southern city was less effective in the Citadel because the walls were too thick. Marines had to use larger charges. The explosions were dangerous to the Marines placing them. Several Marines were wounded by their own breaching charges when the thick walls contained the blast and directed it back toward the attackers. The North Vietnamese in the Citadel fought differently than they had in the southern city. They knew they were trapped. They knew there was no retreat. They fought with the desperation of men who understood they were going to die. The NVA used the height of the walls to their advantage. They would fire down on the Marines from positions the Marines could not suppress without exposing themselves. Marine machine gun teams adapted by using tables and furniture from abandoned buildings to create improvised firing platforms that gave them the height to shoot back. The combat in the Citadel was described by the Marines who fought there as Dante's Inferno. Smoke from fires and explosions reduced visibility to a few feet. The noise was constant. Explosions, machine gun fire, screaming. The smell was worse. Bodies decomposing in the rubble. Sewage from ruptured pipes, smoke and cordite. The Marines advanced building by building, room by room. The same tactics they had developed in the southern city. Mouse-holing where possible. CS gas, grenades, close-range automatic fire. The progress was measured in yards per day. On February 24th, after 11 days of fighting inside the Citadel, the Marines reached the Imperial Palace. The palace was the cultural and symbolic heart of Hue. The North Vietnamese had fortified it heavily. The final assault on the palace took an entire day. When the Marines raised the American flag over the Citadel on February 24th, the North Vietnamese resistance in Hue effectively ended. Small pockets of NVA soldiers continued to fight for another week, but the organized defense had collapsed. The cost was staggering. 142 Marines killed in action, over 1,100 wounded. The army units supporting the operation took 74 killed and over 500 wounded. The South Vietnamese forces took over 300 killed and nearly 1,800 wounded. The North Vietnamese losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 1,000 to over 5,000 killed in action, thousands more wounded. The main force units that had occupied Hue were destroyed as effective fighting formations. It would take the North Vietnamese years to rebuild their combat strength in the region, but the civilian cost was the most horrific. Between 5,800 and 8,000 civilians dead, most killed in the North Vietnamese political purge in the first days of the occupation. Others killed in the crossfire or by American artillery and bombing once the weather cleared. Over 630,000 people displaced. 80% of the city reduced to rubble. Part 6. The shock and the verdict. The North Vietnamese High Command expected the Battle of Hue to be a demonstration of American weakness. They believed that without air support, the Americans would be unable to fight effectively in urban terrain. They believed the American public would not tolerate the casualties required to retake the city. They believed the battle would force the United States to negotiate a withdrawal from Vietnam. They were wrong about the first two assumptions. The Marines fought effectively despite the lack of air support. The Marines accepted the casualties and continued to advance. The adaptation of tactics, the improvisation of weapons employment, the institutional flexibility that allowed junior leaders to make decisions shocked the North Vietnamese commanders who had planned the defense. The North Vietnamese after-action reports from Hue contain phrases that appear nowhere else in their assessment of American forces. Highly disciplined, extremely aggressive, unpredictable in their tactics, determined to continue the attack regardless of losses. These assessments stand in direct contradiction to the propaganda the North Vietnamese had been producing about American soldiers. The propaganda portrayed Americans as soft, reliant on technology, unwilling to fight when the fighting was hard. The officers who fought at Hue knew better. They had watched the Marines adapt and overcome. They had written reports documenting it. But the North Vietnamese were correct about the third assumption. The American public did not tolerate the casualties. The images from Hue shocked the United States. Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, visited Hue during the battle. He returned to the United States and declared on national television that the war was unwinnable. His assessment was based on what he had seen in Hue. President Lyndon Johnson reportedly said after Cronkite's broadcast that if he had lost Cronkite, he had lost Middle America. Johnson announced weeks later that he would not seek re-election. The political trajectory of the Vietnam War changed because of Hue. This is the paradox at the center of the Battle of Hue. The Marines won the tactical fight. They proved they could adapt and fight in urban terrain without the technological advantages they normally relied on. They shocked the North Vietnamese commanders who watched them do it. And the strategic result was American withdrawal. The North Vietnamese did not win at Hue in the tactical sense. They lost the city. They lost thousands of soldiers. They lost the political uprising they had planned for. But they won the strategic objective. They convinced the American public that the war could not be won. The lessons the Marine Corps learned at Hue became the foundation of modern urban warfare doctrine. The techniques the Marines improvised in Hue, mouse-holing, combined arms in close terrain, the integration of CS gas, are now taught at every urban warfare school in the United States military. The battles in Fallujah in 2004 and Ramadi in 2006 were fought using tactics that evolved directly from what the Marines learned in Hue. The North Vietnamese learned lessons too. They learned that their assumption about American helplessness in urban combat was wrong. They learned that the American soldier could adapt faster than North Vietnamese doctrine could respond. They learned that small unit leadership in the American military was more flexible and more dangerous than they had calculated. Those lessons influenced North Vietnamese strategy for the rest of the war. The large-scale urban offensives that characterized Tet were never attempted again. The North Vietnamese shifted to conventional armored attacks in the final years of the war. They had learned that fighting Americans in cities was too costly, even when the Americans had no air support. The verdict is this. The North Vietnamese planned for an enemy that would fight according to doctrine. They got an enemy that rewrote doctrine in real time based on what worked. The Marines arriving in Hue had 1 hour of urban warfare training. Within 2 weeks, they had become proficient at a style of combat that had not been part of their institutional preparation. That adaptation was not luck. It was the product of a military culture that trained its junior leaders to solve problems without waiting for orders from above. The North Vietnamese commanders watching that adaptation were shocked because their system did not work that way. Their junior leaders did not have the authority to improvise. Their tactical planning did not include mechanisms for rapid adaptation during combat. When the plan stopped working, the system did not have a way to generate a new plan fast enough to matter. That is what systems look like when one learns in days and the other learns in months. The fast learner wins the tactical fight, even when the slow learner wins the strategic war. The Marines who fought in Hue did not know they were shocking the enemy. They were trying to stay alive and complete the mission. The lance corporals blowing holes in walls were not thinking about doctrine. They were thinking about how to get to the next building without dying in the street. The sergeants coordinating CS gas attacks were not thinking about institutional learning cycles. They were thinking about how to force the enemy out of a fortified position without leveling the building. But the cumulative effect of those thousands of individual decisions made under fire by men who had not been trained for the fight they were in was a demonstration of organizational adaptability that the North Vietnamese High Command had not expected and could not match. The pockmarked walls of the Citadel still stand in Hue today. They are a memorial to the month when the North Vietnamese expected to demonstrate American weakness and instead discovered American adaptability. The Marines did not have the training, they did not have the doctrine. They did not have the air support they normally relied on. What they had was a system that allowed them to learn under fire and apply those lessons immediately. That system shocked the North Vietnamese commanders who had planned the perfect trap. The trap worked. The Americans could not use their air power, and the Americans won anyway. Not because they were better trained, because they adapted faster. And in combat, the speed of adaptation is more valuable than the perfection of the plan. If your father or grandfather fought in Hue, I want to hear about it in the comments. What unit was he with? What did he tell you about those weeks? The official histories record the timeline and the casualty figures. The stories in the comment section record what it actually felt like to fight room to room for 33 days. Those details matter more than any history book. Write them down. They deserve to be preserved by the people who carry them.